Okay, so as you can see there, I tweaked the title ever so slightly, I would imagine, from how it went out on Facebook and other things. So, forging the Triangular Alliance, the O'Connors, the MacDonalds, and Franco-Scottish politics, roughly 1540 to 1560, although I'll go a little bit either side of those particular dates. So the Triangular Alliance here, just to foreground it, is kind of between the Irish, the Scots, and the French. So Dorothy Dunnett's Queen's Play centres on the politics of the North Atlantic seaboard in the middle of the 16th century, as indeed there's much of her work, as you know much better than I do. While much is known about the politics that existed between the kingdoms of England, France, and Scotland during the 1540s and 1550s, Ireland is very often relegated to a peripheral place in the politics of the time. So an awful lot of the European textbooks today still talk about, say, the interactions between England and the wars with France and Scotland, but they often, they might have a vague mention of Ireland, but not a huge amount of that has improved over the last couple of decades. So an awful lot of this has to do in the 1540s and the 1550s with events in the Midlands and the O'Connor lordship, and then the actions of some of the O'Connors in Scotland and in France. Uh, Jeanette's work was ahead of its time in exploring this angle of the politics of the Atlantic archipelago. So this paper is basically going to explore that a little bit and look at some of the characters that Dunette has in Queen's Play and how they actually overlap with some real life historical characters. Some of them are inventions, some of them are very much based on historical characters. So I'll start with a brief mention of Queen's Play, but obviously I won't go into this in too much detail because, as I say, he know better than I do. Dunet's work itself, but just to give a sense in terms of what elements of it I'm going to be discussing. So the book is set in the middle of the 16th century. It centers on the politics of France, Scotland, Ireland, and England. Some of the characters within it, the Irish characters, are entirely fictitious. So, say for instance, Tady Boy Balloch is not a historical character, although there were an awful lot of people that would have had names like that in 16th century Ireland. So, boy is just, it's a kind of a vague derivation of boy, so it just means yellow. And the Irish were very fond of describing people either as yellow or red, depending on their facial hair or hair color. O'Dwyer is also a very prominent name in Ireland, and the O'Dwyers controlled the small lordship. But there was no Uno O'Dwyer, to the best of my knowledge, active on the continent in the 1440s or the 1450s. Now, it's a different story when it comes to two of the main Irish characters in the book, which are Cormac O'Connor and George Paris. So these are real life historical figures, although Paris was more of a kind of an old English or Anglo-Irishman rather than a strictly ethnically Irish person. So one final person who did actually have a connection to Ireland, who's not central to the book, but does appear in part 4, chapter 4, is Sir John Perrott, reputedly the illegitimate child of Henry VIII, although I think the historical consensus on that has broken down over the last several decades. So Perrott was a young man at the time of Dunette, the time that Queen's Play is set in, but he did later have a very prominent career in Ireland. So he became the vice or the governor of the southern province of Munster between 1571 and 1575, and he later served as Viceroy of Ireland between 1584 and 1588. So, as I say, the purpose of this is to look at what the historical reality was of these characters, but also to explore the background of Ireland in the mid 16th century and why it is the O'Connors ended up in places like Scotland and France. So I'll start by just examining the kind of the broad political situation in Ireland towards the end of the reign of this nice fellow, Henry VIII. So Henry uh, had ascended in 1509. He was the Lord of Ireland. Each of the kings of Ireland going back to the late 12th century when Ireland had been partially conquered by the Anglo-Normans, Cambro-Normans, call them what you will, had held the title of Lord of Ireland. They weren't kings of Ireland. It wasn't until 1541, towards the latter stages of Henry's reign, that an act for the kingly title was passed in the Irish Parliament that made Henry VIII the first English king of Ireland. Now, despite the passage of this particular bill, English rule in Ireland by the start of the 1540s was quite limited. So here is a very kind of well-known map of early modern Ireland that was put together many years ago by the late Ken Nichols. So as you can see here, over on the right-hand side, we have the Pale, which is centered on Dublin. Now, this was the very kind of center of English rule that was fully controlled by the government. Although even here there was an awful lot of Irish penetration in the 16th century. So there was two different, it was bilingual, there was English and Irish spoken. And an awful lot of Irish tenants were actually taking up lands here, which was something that irked an awful lot of officials in Dublin because they thought that, even the Pale now is becoming Gaelicized. So not all of the names are written in here, but as you can see, there are dozens and dozens of different lordships. So not all of them are Irish. Some of them are Old English or Anglo-Norman, so the Butler Earls of Ormond, very powerful here. The Kildares, basically, the Fitzgeralds of Kildare basically control all of the peripheral regions of the Pale, and they were the most powerful magnates in the 15th century and early 16th. But then you have other ones like the O'Neills up here in Ulster and the O'Donnells that are, they control the vast majority of West Ulster along with Maguire, McMahon, O'Reilly. But these are Iritha or sub-kings of the O'Neills. Yeah, then it gets over into the west. The Burkes are actually Anglo-Norman. They were the Burghs who had conquered this part of Ireland back in the 13th century, but they had Gaelicized and become, the old phrase used to be more Irish than the Irish themselves, although that's kind of disappeared from the historiography to a certain extent over the last 30 or 40 years. So the idea here is that, the crown doesn't control an awful lot of the island in the early 16th century. In fact, it was losing ground. So if you take East Ulster here, this in the late medieval period used to be controlled by an English earldom of Ulster, but that had basically disappeared by the 16th century, and you have a Gaelic resurgence that brings the Clan the Bui, O'Neills here, and then you have some other Irish and a few Old English entities hanging on here. So the idea is that after the conquest of the late 12th, 13th, and early 14th century, as the Wars of the Roses happen, or indeed as the English are distracted by the Hundred Years' War in France, the Irish engage in a resurgence and they have come back to control vast amounts of the island. So all of this is important in terms of the fact that you have English officials as early as the 1490s, once the Wars of the Roses have ended, who are writing over to London going, well, this is terrible. We have to try and revitalize English crown rule in Ireland. We have to try and push the Irish back out of the Pale and, reconquer lands in places like East Ulster or various parts of Leinster. Um, they're not listened to a large extent during the reign of Henry VII or for most of the reign of Henry VIII. There's the odd token kind of efforts to reform the lordship. Reform later becoming a kind of a word that has a mixed meaning. Some of it actually, some officials do actually mean trying to actually kind of reform the lordship and bring the Irish into the government, but most of them are talking about basically conquering. So reform is conquest to a large extent. Um, Now, where this takes off and where it starts to gain legs is from 1534 onwards. So in the middle of the political developments over in England, which are associated with the aforementioned Henry VIII, there's a revolt amongst the Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare in 1534. It doesn't last for a particularly long time. It's crushed basically a year later with the capture of Maynooth Castle, the Kildare's main stronghold in Kildare. And most of the heads of the family are taken over to England and they're executed. So their lands are then confiscated. And what you get is you get a whole bunch of officials in Dublin, in the middle of the Pale, who, being the enterprising entrepreneurs they are, see this as a great opportunity to extend English rule even further. So first off, there's this land from the Fitzgeralds that they can get grants of and they can start to set up their own estates. And on top of that, there is a large garrison that is in the Pale because it's left there basically after the suppression of the Kildare Rebellion. So they start very quickly sending these treatises and letters over to Henry VIII, kind of from around the autumn of 1536 onwards. So there's a deluge of them for about 6 months. They're literally writing every week over to Henry VIII or to Thomas Cromwell, and they're saying we should adopt a more aggressive strategy in Leinster. So just to get a sense of this, they have the Pale here. Then there's also this region along the south where Waterford, the city of Waterford is here, and this kind of coastal region is kind of an area of English semi-control. Then there's the Butlers here, that they have two different towns, so Kilkenny and Carrick. And their idea is that they have these pockets. So they have like along the south coast here, and then they have the Pale. And they're kind of thinking, well, if we can the first thing we should do is we should try to join these regions up. So basically to try and conquer all of Leinster. Now, this will soon relate to the O'Connors because as you can see, the O'Connors are here in the Irish Midlands. Now, their initial concern, this is just to zoom in on it, this is a much less uh, polished map, but I produced this one myself, so that's why it looks less polished. But so the O'Connors are here, the O'Moores are here, the Pale is here, and these papers in 1536, they're talking about 5 different lordships: the O'Tooles, the O'Byrnes, the McMurrough-Kavanaghs, and then the O'Moores and the O'Connors. Now, initially in 1536, they're talking quite a lot about how they want to reduce South Leinster. What they mean by South Leinster is basically this region. And by doing that, they assume that they can form a contiguous land that they control between Dublin, south to these port towns here, Old Ross, Wexford, and then Waterford as well, which is just out of view of the map. It has the added benefit of the fact that it will free up like these Irish castles and religious houses like Arklow, Wicklow, Carlow, Leighlin, and Ferns. But they have some very good ideas about how they can, rejuvenate these lands by giving them to the very people who are writing these particular letters over to London. So there's no element of self-interest at all here in terms of what they're doing. Um, Now, they also are mentioning at this point the fact that while these lordships in South Leinster are the priority, it would also not be a bad idea to reduce the O'Moores and the O'Connors, because the Ormonds of Butler are over here. And again, the idea is that if you can get rid of the O'Connors and the O'Moores, you can extend your sphere of control all the way from Dublin down towards the Ormonds in kind of over here in this direction towards Kilkenny. Um, Now, there is a legitimate security concern here. The O'Tooles are literally 10 kilometres from Dublin. They can raid into the Pale at will and they can attack Dublin if they want. So there is legitimate security concerns. It's not all, kind of exploitative opportunism. But the problem is in 1536 that Henry VIII refuses to do it. Eventually, he sends a letter in 1537 telling the officials in Dublin that they're actually stealing from him repeatedly through crown or through official corruption in Dublin, and that instead of talking about spending his money on an expensive military campaign, they should actually just, reform their own administration and stop robbing him. Henry, his main priority, I think, at this stage is to save up the money from this and from the dissolution of the monasteries so that he can waste it in another expensive war in France. So this gets abandoned in 1536. And it's only picked back up again a couple of years later in around 1546. Now, I'll get to the Scottish dimension of this in a minute, but just to show how the jump occurs between, say, 1536 and 1546, and how the attention shifts from this region in South Leinster towards the O'Connors and the O'Moores. Throughout the first half of the 1540s, these officials in Dublin, they vaguely mention the odd time here and there that, they still think that a policy of conquest in Leinster would be a good idea. But they're not as vociferous or as broadcasting it as much as they used to in the past. The occasional policy paper, but they're pretty quiet about it. They know that Henry isn't going to go ahead with it. That is until the mid 1540s, when there is renewed war between England and France and Scotland. They're able to exploit this kind of rhetoric of Irish being a security problem for the English crown. So if you go back to the early stages of the reign of Henry VII, the two pretenders that he had faced in the first 12 to 13 years of his reign, Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, they had both acquired quite an amount of support within Ireland. So there is an awareness of the fact that above and beyond these officials wanting to secure lands in South Leinster, that Ireland is a genuine security threat. The Spanish, or at a later point, the French, could use it as a place that they would invade, set up as a kind of a landing base, and then use to attack England at a later stage. So they begin exploiting this idea of Ireland as a security threat, again, during the rough wooing or the war with the French and the Scots in the 1540s. And what you see by 1545, 1546, is that they're no longer talking about this region in South Leinster. They've now moved over to here. They had mentioned it before, but now this has become the real focus of their discussions around an aggressive kind of policy of conquest and colonization. The reasons for the shift are largely to do with the fact that they have kind of pacified one or two of the heads of these lordships. Some of them have accepted titles or lands, or they've made an agreement with the crown. Whereas some of the heads of the O'Connors and the O'Moores are seen as being you know, a bit more like these barbaric Irish woodcarns that keep raiding into the Pale in this sort of uncivilized fashion. One of the principal ones being Brian O'Connor Fillet, who is the head of the O'Connors, and as we'll see, is the father of Cormac O'Connor. So, as I say, their focus is switched over to here, and they don't manage to convince Henry VIII and his ministers to actually go ahead with a conquest of this region right at this time. But on this occasion, rather than waiting for permission to do so, they just go ahead and do it. So the Viceroy of Ireland between 1540 and 1546 is a chap called Anthony St. Leger. And in 1546, he's over in England answering charges of corruption. Everybody is corrupt in Ireland, in early modern Ireland. It's just a question of, is it an excessive amount of corruption? He's accused of excessive corruption. He's brought over to London. And while he's over there, the treasurer within the Dublin government, William Brabazon, he has been a vocal supporter of an aggressive policy in Leinster going back to 1536, and he launches a raid into the Irish Midlands. He doesn't look for permission from London. He just basically says, "Oh, there's been an attack, and we need to launch a raid into this region." Now, this basically starts the Tudor conquest of Ireland to a large extent. It's the first move in what will eventually become the English conquest of the entire island by the early 17th century. So it doesn't just stop with a kind of a retaliatory raid into Offaly and Laois. It turns into a much broader conquest where, by 1547, 1548, they're setting up military forts, and then the idea is that these military forts will become civilian colonies over time. So kind of following Roman precedents, did you have a military or a military colony that evolves into a civilian colony? So that's what's happening in this particular part of the world. And by the end of the 1540s, it's becoming clear to the O'Connors and the O'Moores that they're facing a kind of an existential crisis. Their lands are being surveyed by the Crown in preparation for basically handing them out to a couple of dozen officials in Dublin. And they're aware of the fact that the clock is ticking in terms of their particular survival. So that's the situation in Leinster and why the O'Connors find themselves looking for allies abroad. Now, in terms of the Scots, this is a map kind of focusing in more closely on Ulster in the first half of the 16th century. So, as I mentioned, the Clan de Buia O'Neills are here. The English do still have control of the outpost of Carrickfergus here. So Carrickfergus Castle, if any of you are ever in Belfast or in Northern Ireland, it's well worth a visit to Carrickfergus. It's still pristinely preserved, and it's very impressive. Still a few English here, but the main thing to point out here is that the Scots have a presence in Ulster. So this is down as the Scots of the Glens, but in reality, we might just change that to the MacDonalds of the Glens. So this region is the Route and the Glens, and then they also have control of Rathlin Island, which is a fairly important island there. So the MacDonalds transcend the North Channel here between East Ulster and the Outer Hebrides, which is off the map, but obviously up towards Islay and Argyll and places like that. So the Scots are viewed as a security threat in and of themselves by the English during the 16th century. So, along with these policy papers that are being written, kind of discussing the idea of securing English control over South Leinster, another issue which regularly arises is the threat posed by the MacDonalds and how they need to maybe get some galleys to patrol the waters here in order to try and sunder connections between Ulster and the Outer Hebrides. Um, so, if you're the O'Connors, the McDonald's are a kind of a natural ally to have and to maybe communicate with, especially if you're thinking to yourself, well, us Irish, we're very divided, we're constantly attacking each other. So we don't seem to be able to unite in front of the English threat. But if we can acquire aid from the Scots or from the French, who just very conveniently happen to be at war with England, maybe we can set up a kind of a triangular alliance which will help to, save the O'Connors and the O'Moores in the Irish Midlands. So this is what they decide to do basically from 1547. Just in terms of the MacDonalds, they do feature in the rough wooing or the 8 Years' War. So you have the same viceroy in Dublin, Anthony St. Leger, is kind of regularly writing to London around 1544, 1545, basically saying I need financing for a couple of ships in order to actually sunder the connection between Ulster and Scotland. So they're aware of the fact that there's a problem here in terms of the fact that the Scottish constitute a kind of a fifth column within Ireland. Okay. So just to overview the rough wooing very, very quickly. Again, I'm sure you're all quite aware of this, but Henry goes to war. His idea is to basically, well, to this outlandish idea that he can reignite the Hundred Years' War by wasting all of the money that he's gotten from the dissolution of the monasteries. In the end, he manages to take over a small French town, Bologna, for a couple of years and ends up bankrupt again at the end of it. But on the other side of that, he is also trying to force the Scots into marrying uh, Mary, Queen of Scots, off to his own son, the future Edward VI. Okay, so the war will drag on for, another basically into the early 1550s, though the kind of the nature of it changes over time in terms of the fact that it becomes increasingly clear that the actual marriage is not going to occur, and Mary eventually ends up marrying into the French royal family herself. Um, but all of these events are kind of overlapping between Ireland, France, and Scotland. And it's at this point that you get a number of Irish individuals, or in the case of George Paris, an old English individual leaving Ireland and heading off for the French court. So I'll focus on three particular individuals here, two of which feature in Queen's play, and one of which is mentioned. So these are Brian O'Connor Fillet, who, as I mentioned, is the head of the O'Connor lordship in Offaly at the time of the beginning of the conflict in 1546, and then Cormac O'Connor and George Paris. So here's a print from John Derrick's The Image of Ireland. This is actually from 1581, but I think it captures the nature of kind of Irish and English soldiers in 16th century Ireland. Um, Yeah, and I don't have a portrait of Cormac O'Connor or George Paris, so this is in lieu of a portrait. So Brian O'Connor Follett, as the first one of these three individuals, is basically he's arrested quite shortly after the campaign into the Midlands begins. He's taken to Dublin Castle originally, then he's sent over to England, and he's made to surrender some of his lands, at least nominally, even though doesn't exactly hold up in law. At one stage, he does manage to try and escape from the Tower in London, and his plan is to make his way to Scotland, which is obviously fairly indicative of where the O'Connors are where their mindset is in terms of aid from Scotland at the time. But he doesn't make it. He's captured again before he makes it to Scotland. Um, so Dunnett is well read up on this. She states in Queen's Play when Brian O'Connor is briefly being described that, quote, his fodder is between four walls in the Tower of London. So this is in reference to Cormac O'Connor's fodder. Um, so that's Brian. Now he comes back into the story again in the 1550s when he manages to come back, but suppose to focus mostly on George Paris and Cormac because they are the two characters that feature most prominently in Queen's Play. George Paris's story is kind of revelatory when it comes to O'Connor's and developments in the Irish Midlands. So this is actually one slight area where Dunnett gets a minor detail slightly wrong, but as I'll explain in a minute, quite understandable because she was actually dealing with a historiography that was very, very underdeveloped when she was carrying out her research. So she quotes Paris as being a rangy Irishman gifted with considerable powers of intrigue who happened to be on his way home to Ireland. He's from Ireland, but theoretically, I think you would say he wasn't actually an Irishman. He was an Old English man from a family in County Meath in the kind of the northern end of the Pale. Um, but it wasn't uncommon for Old English people to be interacting quite strongly with Irish lordships at this time, and you get an awful lot of them that were acting as agents, sometimes because they needed, somebody that was bilingual to carry out trade or diplomacy, and sometimes act as intermediaries with officials in Dublin. Um, so yeah, so he's actually his backstory. He was involved on some level in the Kildare rebellion back in the mid 1530s, and he seems to have been a kind of a retainer to the Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare, and then after that he finds some sort of employ as an agent for the O'Connors. So he's kind of the O'Connors have stepped into a political vacuum, and Paris ends up working for them. Now, an awful lot of what is written in Dunnett's book overlaps with what we actually know about Paris. So he shows up at the French court in the late 1540s. He's acting as an agent for the O'Connors. He's trying to influence them towards intervening in Ireland, and he's also traveling pretty extensively between Ireland, Scotland, and France during these years. So Dunnett's representation of him is very accurate, and again, as I'll say, it's surprising that she actually had figured this out at the time that she was writing. Um, so at one point in late 1549, he actually arrives to Ulster in the north of Ireland with two French envoys who are basically tasked with evaluating the situation on the ground and whether or not it is feasible to launch a French military expedition to the island, as the O'Connors and as Paris were arguing for in Paris. Um, they don't report back too positively. They kind of say, the Irish seem to be immensely divided amongst themselves. They're more interested in kind of cattle raids into their own lordships than actually unifying against the English. So the trip doesn't go particularly well in that regard. Um, Nevertheless, Paris is back in Paris in 1551, this time along with Cormac O'Connor, who is the son of Brian O'Connor Fillet and kind of, becomes his nominal heir to the lordship, even though the lordship is being dismembered. So Cormac has joined Paris and he's basically doing the same thing that he was. He's trying to convince him of the fact that an expedition can be launched to Ireland. And then they eventually head off to Scotland and they spend some time there, also trying to convince the sort of the French Regency government that is in control of the Scottish government during Mary Queen of Scots' minority that this is also possible. Unfortunately, events catch up on them. So the war comes to between England, Scotland, and France largely comes to an end around 1550, 1551. So Edward Seymour, first Duke of Somerset, is the head of the government of Edward VI between 1547 and around 1550, late 1549, until his downfall. Now, once Seymour is removed from the scene, as you all know, the Duke of Northumberland starts to come to power, and the costly war that Somerset had been waging against the Scots primarily and against the French is abandoned because it's costing too much, and obviously there's an awful lot of discontent within England, which was seen in the Prayer Book Rebellion and various other revolts in England at the very end of the 1540s. So the war is brought to an end. You know, all sides have spent an awful lot of money. Nothing has really been gained again, as is so often the case in early modern wars in Europe. And this means that the O'Connors are now in a bit of a bind. There's no way that they can convince either the French or the Scots to go ahead with this triangular alliance and the proposed invasion of Ireland. So George Paris returns to Ireland. He's seen as a bit of an opportunist who moves on to some other cause where he can benefit himself afterwards. Cormac O'Connor spends several years in Scotland afterwards, but he does eventually return to Ireland and he becomes a kind of a leading um, guerrilla uh, leader, as it were. So what happens basically in the Irish Midlands after the triangular alliance is kind of abandoned is um, there's some initial land grants made at the beginning of the 1550s. These aren't really a systematic plantation, but then in 1556, a new viceroy, who's a very energetic governor of Ireland, Thomas Radcliffe, third Earl of Sussex, initiates a much more organised, systematic plantation of the O'Connor and O'Moore lands in Laois and Offaly. So Sussex is, to my mind, it seems like he wants to conquer Ireland. He thinks that he's enough influence at court that he can increase the size of the army establishment until he can conquer large parts of the country. Ends in total failure to a large extent because every governor of Ireland underestimates the amount of men that it's going to take to actually conquer all of the lordships. And eventually they only managed to do it at the end of the 16th century, when they increased the army to nearly 20,000 men, whereas even under Sussex, it only goes up to about 2,500. So, so Sussex initiates this more systematic plantation in the Midlands. Land given out to just over 100 Old English and New English colonists, but they don't really have the resources to actually implemented fully. And there's a guerrilla war that is launched by the remnants of the O'Connors and the O'Moores that just goes on for decades. It becomes very severe in the 1570s and then again in the 1590s. So as soon as the Nine Years' War, the Northern Lords launch against English rule breaks out in Ulster, you immediately have these pockets of O'Connors and O'Moores that suddenly just materialize in the Midlands. You know, they're just waiting for an opportunity to try and reclaim their lands. Um, so that's kind of what happens to them. Now, in the long run, the Tudor conquest of Ireland is successful, and you know there are some O'Connors and some O'Moores that they manage to acclimatize and they get small token little farms and all the rest of it. But you know, for the most part, they're all replaced. Cormac O'Connor kind of disappears almost from the record. Interestingly, and I had mentioned that I've actually transcribed this document and written a paper on it years ago that I can distribute. He writes this paper that he submits to the government in the mid 1560s, where you know he basically asks for a reversal of the plantation, and he kind of says, "Oh well, you know, the best thing to do here would be to just give us back our lands, and we're best placed in order to restore security and control to the Midlands." Um, Unsurprisingly, it's not his ideas are not accepted. Um, but yeah, but he spends that period of time, a lot of the 1560s and into the early 1570s, moving around Ireland, and he occasionally pops up raiding a fort or a farm or some such. Some of this is not in the Midlands, so he's down in Munster in the south. He's even over in Connacht occasionally, but he kind of disappears then from the record. It's not clear exactly when he dies, but at some stage, maybe around 1573. Um, so that's that kind of generation of O'Connors passing from the scene. Um, as regards the Scots, well, things work out a bit better for them because of this particular chap. So James VI, as we all know, becomes the King of England and Ireland, as well as James I in 1603, following the death of Elizabeth I. Now, up until the end of the reign of Elizabeth, the MacDonald presence in Ulster had still been perceived as a problem, especially because you have Scottish mercenaries, that it's not just in the northeast. So just to go back to this map, it's not just here. Especially in the 1580s, you have a situation where you've large bands of Scottish gallowglass or mercenaries that occasionally land into places like, you know, um, Loch Foyle here or parts of Donegal, and even um, all the way down here into Connacht. So the Scots continue to be seen as a problem in Ireland until 1603. And once James VI becomes king, the situation just changes pretty much overnight. So the MacDonalds are accepted as a presence in northeast Ulster, and eventually they are granted the title of Earls of Antrim. And then there's a huge influx of other Scottish settlers. So people like James Hamilton, Hugh Montgomery, who acquire a lot of land at knockdown rates in East Ulster directly after the war. And then when the Ulster Plantation is organised by James's government from 1607 onwards, the decision is taken very quickly that it's going to be a British project. So the lands that are allocated for people from England and Britain in general, there's an equal share between the Scots and the English. So the Scots do pretty well. The O'Connors are destroyed. The French did finally intervene in Ireland. It just happened in 1798, so about a quarter of a millennium too late. Um, so, in terms of just to say something briefly, the end about Dunett's methodology in terms of determining what the role of George Paris was and what the role of Cormac O'Connor are. It's quite surprising that she actually had as much detail as she did on them, given when she was writing. So, her research, I assume, has been carried out in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And at that stage, the historiography of Tudor Ireland was still very, very underdeveloped. So the most comprehensive account of Tudor Ireland at that point was still Richard Bagwell's three-volume study Ireland under the Tudors, which had been written in the late 19th century. There was no study on the O'Connors on the continent or anything to do with this kind of triangular alliance. It was briefly alluded to in some things, but not in detail. I think you would have struggled to find anything that was talking in depth about George Paris or Cormac O'Connor. On top of that, the calendar of state papers, which are in 11 different volumes for the Tudor era, the very first one of them dealt with 1509 up to 1573. So, over half of the period. And it wasn't a calendar. It was a kind of a prototype. They changed the methodology after that first volume, but the first volume was basically a catalogue. So it didn't have any information on the O'Connors, the MacDonalds, all the rest of it. At best, you had a 2 or 3 line description of what a letter was. So basically, who wrote it, who it was to, where it was written, and the date, pretty much. So she couldn't rely on that calendar of state papers either. So I assume that she did have resort to some of the original manuscripts in the old Public Records Office in Kew in London. Um, so yeah, so she was ahead of her time, I think, in terms of suggesting or in exploring this kind of interaction between the O'Connors, the Scots, and the French, and the O'Connors at the French court in the mid 16th century. This wouldn't be written about in depth in any Irish historiography until the 1980s or the 1990s. So, in conclusion, Queen's Play was actually drawing on solid historical events that were occurring in Ireland in the 1540s and 1550s, and how lordships like those of the O'Connors were facing an existential threat from the crown as the government expanded into the Midlands. So, in response, several members of those clans left Ireland to try and acquire land in Scotland and France, or to acquire aid in Scotland and in France at the time, and the Scots did have a presence in the northeast of Ireland and posed a major threat to the Crown's security in the Irish Sea. Dunnett was ahead of her time in picking up on this and incorporating details of the activities of Cormac O'Connor and George Paris in France and Scotland in the late 1540s and 1550s into her book. So that's the argument. I do have briefly. I don't know if you want to maybe look at this after the Q&A or if I'll go through it now, but just some of the sources in terms of potentially further reading if anybody wants to kind of explore this a little bit further. So yeah, I can go through that now. Will I or yeah? Okay.
I think now, please.
Okay. Grant, so as you can see, there's a bit of shameless self-promotion here at the very start. So I had an article in Irish Historical Studies back in 2016 that's on the reduction of Leinster and the origins of the Tudor conquest of Ireland. So that explores what I discussed there about the efforts to kind of lobby the government to conquer South Leinster, and then how it transferred from South Leinster to the Irish Midlands with the O'Connors and the O'Moores, basically between 1536 and 1546. The most comprehensive study of Franco-Irish relations during the 16th century is Mary Ann Lyons' Franco-Irish Relations, 1500 to 1610. The earlier chapters explore an awful lot of this interaction of the O'Connors with the French court. But it also goes on to explore later connections as well, going through right until the 1580s and the 1590s. But yeah, as I say, there's a lot of detailed information there on the O'Connors. Likewise with David Potter's French intrigue in Ireland during the reign of Henry II. So that is looking again at this kind of idea of a triangular strategy between the Irish, French, Scots, and that should be available um, that's available on JSTOR, so that should be fairly easy to get a hand on, as should my article in IHS. Mary Ann Lyons might be a bit more difficult because I don't think that book ever went to paperback, but a lot of libraries would have it. And then there's a couple of other ones. So Alison Cathcart wrote a very good article over 10 years ago now in Scottish Historical Review, which looked at so Donald Dove, so basically the MacDonalds, how they fit into the rough wooing and what was going on between Ulster, Ireland, and how the English were responding at that time. That's also explored in Peter Pivaronis's thesis at Michigan State University, 1972. So there's a chapter in there that discusses kind of the mid 1540s and his efforts to deal with what's going on in Ulster. Again, I'm pretty sure that there is a PDF of that available online, that it has been digitized. And then, as I say, my own article on Cormac O'Connor's device for the government of Ireland is in Ossory, Laois and Leinster, which could be tricky to find a copy of. But as I say, I'll pass on a PDF of that, and it can be distributed to anybody that might want to have a look at it. So yeah, that's about it. Those are, as I say, those are some, maybe if you want to explore a bit further in terms of the actual nuance of it. I've provided kind of, I suppose, an overview, but there's a bit more detail of these various things in those works. So yeah.
Thank you. Quite fascinating. If you could stop screen sharing now, and then we can see you properly.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'm not at all surprised that she seems to have done original archival research, but that really brought home to us. It's as though she'd read all those articles and books that you were citing 20 years before they were published. I hadn't really grasped how innovative she was being in that respect. So there's one question in the Q&A. I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble manipulating Q&A and chat at the same time. But that's about the Scottish archers. So quite an important element of Queen's Play is about Scottish archers. Do they come into your story anywhere? Are there sources for those that you might be able to say anything about?
The short answer is no, I don't think that they really do. Maybe there might be something mentioned in the nuance of the letters, but I don't think that there is. As I
There
say,
was a
most of
real,
it.
sorry, I was going to say that the attempt by Robin Stewart in the book is based on a real character. So perhaps that's just where she's getting that from.
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think they don't come into the to any of the letters that I'm aware of. Yeah, because I mean most of these letters as well, that a lot of them aren't actually original letters from like Cormac or George. They're actually they're written by English agents who are just kind of tracking what they're doing. But yeah, I not that I'm aware of that
Right.
it comes into them.
So I think I said to you when we first discussed this, what she likes to do, she likes to take a fictional character and put them next to a real character.
Okay.
If you if you're looking around to write about the Irish presence in France, do you think Cormac O'Connor was the obvious choice, or would there have been anybody else that she could have picked?
For this particular time period, I think he was the obvious choice. Um, yeah, himself and Cormac were the two really obvious ones. Yeah, there might have been one or two others that were kind of. I mean, there would have been some individuals that were moving between Ireland and France because there was quite an extensive bit of trade going on. Which is again wildly underappreciated, I think, in the historiography, how extensive it was in terms of a French wine being brought into Ireland. But when it comes to the actual court, Cormac and George were definitely, I think, the two obvious individuals for her to have picked.
Right, sorry. Somebody's asked if the expression beyond the pale refers to beyond the pale. I know the answer to that. Yes, it does. Uh, and somebody has suggested that were there archives in the National Library of Scotland that she might have used?
There could have been one or two little bits of letters that would have referred to it. But the primary ones would have been in so SP 61 and 62. So the state papers, Edward VI and state papers, Mary the First to a certain extent because the O'Connors were still kind of absent from Ireland. But SP 61 in Q would have been, that's where most of the letters were. Some of them, there is some continental documents as well that Mary Ann Lyons goes through in her book that were produced that are in French archives.
Sorry. And somebody has written any advice on how we can get her work better known and taken more seriously? She was a serious historian in
Yeah.
some ways.
Hmm. Um, I mean, I would imagine that this angle in terms of maybe exploring how her work was ahead of certain elements of the historiography of various countries might be a way to do it. So, I mean, this idea that, that she was, exploring topics that literally hadn't been explored, say, in the Irish historiography, I think might be a good angle there from the point of view of that. I mean, it does seem to me like she must have looked at some of these original letters in Kew. I can't see that she would have had the information that she had on the O'Connors if it was just operating from the work that was available in print in the 1950s. So I think that might be a good angle. Obviously, you could maybe extrapolate more from that in terms of the Scottish historiography, but I wouldn't. Yeah, that'd be beyond maybe.
And somebody
Um,
has asked, Queen's Place suggests there's an Irish diaspora around the French court at that time. It's not just Cormac O'Connor, it's kind of people who, well, the two women have just travelled to Ireland, from Ireland to France ostensibly, for almost for social reasons. Does your research back that up? Is the question.
there was definitely some people that were traveling over and back, and in the opposite direction. So you have these strange stories about Austrian aristocrats showing up strangely in Ireland, just visiting. So some of them were going to Patrick's Purgatory, but the diaspora community in France is growing at that time, and then it shifts to Spain because of the wars of religion, because they're figuring that the Spanish is the best place to go to in order to acquire potential support, because the French are just out of the picture for several decades in terms of they're not going to be sending an expedition to Ireland when they're at war with each other. But it is growing, and even in the midst of the wars of religion, you have Shane O'Neill in Ulster in kind of around the mid 1560s, who is in contact with the Guise family, so the Cardinals of Lorraine, and they're sending over people to see what might possibly happen there. Um, but it's growing the entire time. I mean, it really takes off, I suppose, in the 17th and the 18th century when you have Irish lords that are and their retainers that are leaving, and they're forming brigades out of the Habsburg armies on the continent. But it's definitely, yeah, it's increasing. And yeah, and then there's also the mercantile element to it. So there's already, an Irish merchant community, particularly in Bordeaux, because of the wine trade. So yeah, it's growing. And as I say, Marianne Lyons' book explores that pretty well. And if you're looking for the later period, her books, there's two of them with Tom O'Connor that are called, they actually have very similar titles, but it's like the Irish on the continent or Irish communities on the continent. But Marianne Lyons and Thomas O'Connor, that they've really gone into it in depth in terms of, as I say,
And
Irish
one last
diaspora.
question. Sorry, one last question. I've read Barden's The Plantation of Ulster. Is there anything to read focused more on what was happening in the south at that time?
In the south, is in around Munster, in the south and in Leinster and Connacht. There's loads, but let me think. What would be the best? Raymond Gillespie wrote a general survey uh, years ago that was just called 17th Century Ireland. In terms of the plantations in Munster, the best book to read, it's a really, really good piece of scholarship, is Michael McCarthy Morrow, the Munster Plantation. So I think he has the dates 1586 to 1641. It's out of print. That book is, I think, in order to acquire it, you'd have to spend several £100 on a copy of it. The copy of it up on archive.org, and also his PhD thesis is available as a PDF online. And it's actually, I even though I have the book, I actually refer to the thesis quite a bit, because he has these excellent appendixes that didn't find their way. They were excised from the book. But he charts, say, how the Munster plantation developed all the way from 1586 up to the outbreak of the 1641 rebellion. Beyond that, for the rest of the country, I suppose, I mean, there's all sorts of niche articles that you could read. The chapters in the Cambridge New History of Ireland, they're okay in terms of a general kind of overview of the earlier period, or sorry, of the period from 1603 to 1641. Yeah, there's I mean, there are all sorts of other plantations as well that are going on around. There's new plantations in the Midlands and Wexford. They're proposing colonizing Connacht, though that never happens. I mean, the best book in terms of exploring all those plantations is Nicholas Canny, Making Ireland British.
Okay,
But
thank you.
no.
That's absolutely fascinating. We are pretty much at time. Oh, and the person who asked the question is pleased with the answer. So I'm just going to say thank you very much. That was absolutely revelatory. And I'm so pleased that I finally do understand what Cormac O'Connor is doing there in Queen's Clay. Thank you very much indeed. We'd all like to I'm sure everyone agrees with me that was a really good talk for our purposes.
Okay. Listen. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me to give it.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We'll make the recording available. David, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Really enjoyable.